Product Manager at Shopline. Here we'll be talking about the governance for API design at scale. Thanks, Ali.
Hi everyone, I'm Nauman. I'm a product manager at Stoplight, where we're building an API design and governance platform. And I'm primarily looking at the design and governance tooling here. As you can see by my backdrop, probably, we were recently acquired by SmartBear, so now we're joining forces with them to build a more holistic development platform. Tonight, I want to talk about a topic that is very close to my heart, which is governance, API design governance primarily, and tackling the problem, especially at scale. I know the time's short, so I'll just get right into it. All right, so what's the issue? One of the biggest issues that we've seen with larger enterprises, especially building APIs on the large scale, say in the order of hundreds, with teams distributed geographically across the world, is that you have a lot of APIs being built. That is just the nature of software development at this point. What happens is a lot of those APIs are built in silos by different teams, and what you see is fragmentation and inconsistency. So it's not just bad developer experience for people who are eventually using those APIs outside the organization, but even internally, especially at scale, that causes a lot of issues, both in terms of what APIs you have, the quality of them, and just general developer experience as you start consuming and maintaining these APIs over time. So the way to tackle that, and we see a lot of those programs spinning up in organizations, is API governance. And the idea is to go from this fragmented, inconsistent world to a streamlined scenario where your APIs are more consistent. They look similar, you know where they are, how they work, and they're easier to use. That's the primary goal of governance itself, but it's not an easy task, especially for organizations who already have legacy APIs or haven't started from with governance at the start, which is the case for most organizations itself. And the key objectives for governance are: you want consistency. So you want your APIs to look similar. They need to work together well. So let's say you're using a user model. What you'd prefer is for those user models to look the same in your different APIs, even across teams, across departments, so that the interoperability is better. You'd want your teams to be collaborating much more than they might be in a siloed environment. Also, a big piece that we see with organizations is security. As you build more APIs, you want them to be secure, but it gets harder as you grow in number of people, number of APIs. And if you do not have an effective API governance program, that starts to get tricky. All right, so how do you get started with that? Let's say you're starting your API platform, it's just early stages, or let's say you have a lot of APIs. How do you get started by governing the APIs that you already have and that you might build in the future? Before I get into the steps as to what we need to do, just some essential tips that whatever steps you're taking, wherever you are in the journey, these are some things that you should take into account, which is, don't think of an API governance as a one-step process. It's a journey where you start with the smaller steps, things that are easier, things that you can get adoption for, and then you keep learning and improving along the way. So start small and grow as you improve your program itself. API governance shouldn't be something that is enforced on people. It's more about making the right thing easy to do. So instead of creating these set of guidelines that not a lot of people would follow, make them part of the process, make the people part of the process itself, and automate wherever you can. And that's the next step. The best way to do good API governance is to automate whatever we can. And we live in a world where open APIs become such a common thing that automation generally, with all the tooling out there, it is something that you can easily do if you put your mind and effort to it. All right, so what's the step one? Step one is you have a lot of APIs already, and what that causes is an API sprawl problem. Potentially having APIs that are abandoned that you don't know about. So the first step is to get all of them together and know what your APIs are. And for that, set up an API catalog. This is not about a developer portal that you're putting outside for your organization, that the APIs that you put out externally. It's more an internal developer portal, an internal catalog of all your APIs, what they are, how them, where they're used, potentially some documentation for it. And for that, the first step is to mandate having an API specification. It doesn't necessarily need to be design first. It can be code first, but just having an API specification that you can generate some documentation for, have a know of what those APIs are, and putting them in your catalog. So I don't think that's the first step to governance in this era that we live in, which is having an API specification itself and mandating that every API that has been built or is being built has an API spec itself. Now, the best practices for an API catalog, and these might not be easy, but something that you really need to put your mind to is include all your APIs. So include APIs that might just be used by one or two teams, or the ones that are used across the organization. The important doesn't matter. I think the idea is to have all of them within this catalog so that we encourage reuse, we encourage visibility into those APIs so we can start governing them effectively. Make this catalog accessible to everyone. This doesn't need to be just developers or engineers, be it product managers, be it other teams, be it the business folks. Everybody should have access to the API catalog itself. And having a good search really helps as people try and build new APIs. They need to know if there's an existing one that they can potentially use or get some ideas for the new APIs that they're building. And having an efficient search helps you do that. If you can't find it, it doesn't really exist. And I think we talked about it before, but once you have the specs generated from your API specification so that the source of truth is the specifications itself, and you're not doing duplicate work, and also that you're having consistency in the documentation that's being generated so people know what to expect. Now with the API catalog set up, what's the next step that you can take? The next step would be to reduce the inconsistency that you might come across. And once you have your specifications, you can start to see as to how those APIs might look different. You might have models that are being used in different ways, naming conventions that are not being followed. And how you go about reducing that inconsistency is by setting up an API style guide. Not the 80-page PDF guide. Like, it's great. If these are great steps, and a lot of these larger organizations have done that in the past, that have had mature programs, is setting up a style guide of how do you do versioning, what naming conventions you use, what your pagination methods are. But in the world that we live in, we can do the automated kind, where you create rules for some of these guidelines that you have, while you still need to decide on what those guidelines are. But as we talked about in terms of what the essential tips for governance are, making it easy is important to actually getting adoption and not getting in the way of developers. And the idea that you can automate these rules, much like you'd have linting rules for your code, you can have linting rules for your open API specification, and they can be run even on things that have been generated from code first, or if you're designing first, even better, so that you can fix them first. But instead of people reading big PDFs that they might not actually end up reading, not many developers like that, you can create these rules. You can use a tool like Spectral, open source by Stoplight, or Redocally has a linting tool too. but there are these popular linters out there. You have examples of rule sets itself that you can end up using. Just make sure you have a good set to start with, and you can iterate and improve over it later. So what should an API style guide include? I'll not read everything out here, but just to give you a sense of what style guides can contain. Have a good set of best practices for your open API and async API, like always have descriptions, always have operation IDs, adding tags, all these things that might be ignored while writing open API specs as they're being written by so many different people. Just making sure you have a good set of guidelines and what to do about open APIs or async APIs itself. You can have rules for your URL guidelines, like what your path conventions look like, what parameters, casing do you use, and like you can see in the slide here, different companies do things differently, but the idea is to settle on one thing and make sure you have those guidelines set up. Things like don't use file extensions and paths, that's not a company thing, that's just something you should end up doing anyways. Have a versioning strategy, be it within the path, be it within the header, or on your server, whatever it is, make sure you decide on one versioning strategy and apply it across your APIs, especially for the ones being built new, and potentially new versions that are being built for the old APIs themselves. You can add a lot of security best practices. There are rule sets out there already for things like OWASP top 10, but if you want to build on top of that or build your rules themselves, but you can do a lot around security, do rules around error handling, like hopefully no errors in 200 responses, but what kind of an object do you want to use, what structure it is, which error responses do you generally always put into your specifications. You can add a documentation guide on what length of descriptions you have, add a spelling check. You can do a lot with these style guides themselves. If you're using specific tooling, create rules around that, like you might be using a gateway that requires special extensions or maybe a code generation setup. And if you're using industry standards like JSON API or open banking, you might find style guides for them already, but you can also build one on your own if you and that would help enforce those standards and follow them better. All right, so the next step would be to provide. Now you have style guide set up, you have an API catalog. The third would be to provide reusable components. You want to increase reuse, and for that you would want to provide reusable components themselves. A set of models, maybe it might be domain models, error models, or pagination structures that you use. The idea is to provide these out of the box so new developers coming in can get started quickly, or existing API designers can just get started much faster rather than having to rebuild these things. And it generally leads to inconsistencies if you're not really reusing. Like I said before, it could be domain models, error models, common data types that are used across your APIs. And if you're using an industry standard like JSON API, you could just provide those models to start off. Like, this is how the error looks like. This is how the request looks like. Enumerations like country codes that might be used across your organization, again, should be something that is reusable rather than being built separately for APIs. Now, we have a catalog, we have a style guide, we have some reusable components. Rolling them out, it's about socializing them. So socialize your style guides, socialize your reusable components using good documentation, make it available for everybody within your catalog, preferably, so people can see these are your APIs. These are some of the guidelines that you follow if you are building new APIs themselves. And bring it where your designers or developers are. So rather than making it a separate document, if you enforce it as part of your IDEs, be it the Stoplight Studio that helps you design APIs, or VS Code, whatever you use, you can bring those style guides right within it so that you see those linting errors right there, reusable components accessible right there itself, and that makes it much easier to use, getting back to the principle of making things easier to use themselves. Next step would be to improve collaboration. which is set up a review process. It might feel a bit bureaucratic, but it promotes collaboration, be it you don't necessarily need to stop people from merging things in if there are no reviews, but just having a process then itself is useful, and you could use the Git workflow itself. Developers, designers are already used to following that for their code, and they could do the same for their API designs. Make the standards, be it reusing reusable components or the linting errors, make them part of your review process itself, so that you can focus on more important things like, does the API do what it is meant to do, rather than focusing on these are the naming conventions or this is how the error object should look like. This really makes things faster. So the review can then focus on business capabilities, use cases, what does the developer experience look like, is the documentation there, rather than things that we don't really need to worry about because they're enforced as part of the style guidelines themselves. Improve and iterate. Don't, like we said, it's a step-by-step process. You can create a smaller set of rules, a small set of reusable components, and just improve, learn what works, and iterate over it. There are other things that you can do too, potentially. If you improve the diffs, rather than folks looking at code and seeing diffs where it's just all text, if they actually get a visual diff, potentially even breaking change detection, it really makes things easier. Not everybody needs to know OpenAPI for them to work on it, or for them to work on APIs itself. So if you provide a good interface for them to design, if you provide a good diff, they don't really need to get into JSON or YAML and look at long diffs themselves. And that really helps. If you detect if there's a breaking change, you can have a conversation about it within the review process itself, rather than having to know about it later once it breaks things for consumers, be it internal or external. You can provide templates as you grow more mature. This is a template for a good particular kind of an API that you might have within your organization, which already includes some models, error responses, naming conventions, all done within an OpenAPI. So basic template of an OpenAPI of what good looks in the organization, so they can get started quickly and be more consistent. You can automatically validate your specs against your developed API once it's out there. There are contract testing tools out there in the wild, a lot of them that you can potentially use to enforce that the API spec actually matches what was developed, which is an important part of this conversation as governance becomes more mature within your organization. Just to finish it up, I know I've been going pretty fast on this, but API governance is a journey. It's not a one-off task, so make it about doing the right thing to start off and then just improving as you learn along the way. Each step counts. So be it a small organization or a large one, just having a catalog is better than not having one, but having style guides is even better. And don't wait for all your answers. Start now. Governance, as your API has become more in number, there are more of them, it's just harder to govern them. So if you start now, you can always learn along the way and make this better. This was me. I know I ran through a lot of things, but hopefully this was useful. If you have any questions, let me know. Thank you.
Thanks for such a good tips about.
The API Connect Hong Kong 2023 conference is powered by bNovelty Limited. Check out more API-related education content on bnovelty.com or apidays.hk for more information.